This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
We welcome you now to our next lesson in our survey of world religions. We've come to lesson number 14, which is entitled Daoism, the Path of Least Resistance. Daoism, the Path of Least Resistance. Now you notice I pronounce that as Daoism, even though it is spelled with a T. It is my understanding that that is the correct pronunciation of it. It is not Taoism, but Daoism. But before getting into this lesson today, I want to give you some interesting figures that you might find helpful. You may want to take these down in your notes. These figures are based on 1980 statistics, and so they are a few years out of date. They're not completely recent, but yet I think they represent what would still be true today. In looking at the population of the world as a whole, in 1980, 33% of the world's population was considered Christian. Now that's speaking of Christianity, of course, in the very broadest sense, and that takes in all those who would claim to be following Jesus Christ, whether Catholic or Protestant or otherwise. 33% was Christian of the world. 17% of the world was Muslim. They belonged to the religion called Islam. And 13% was Hindu, 6% was Buddhist, and all the rest of the world, the other 31%, included the Taoist and the Shintoist and the Animist and so on. But 33% Christian, 17% Muslim, 13% Hindu, and 6% Buddhist. 31% included everything else. Now, when it took the 33% of the world that was Christian, it broke it down further and showed what percentages of the world's population belonged to the various groups which claimed to be Christian. 15% of the world was Roman Catholic. 3% of the world was Orthodox. That would be Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. 8% of the world was Protestant. And 7% of the world, that the Christian world, referred to or belonged to other religious groups that could not be classified as Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. Well, I thought those figures might be interesting to you and helpful to you, but now we want to continue on with our study of Daoism, which we've entitled The Path of Least Resistance. And I think the reason that we have entitled it this will become clear by the time we've completed our study today. There are three major religions of ancient China: Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism. Of these three great religions of ancient China, Confucianism and Daoism are native to China. Buddhism, of course, came in from elsewhere. It originated in India, but it was brought to China from other countries. In order for us to understand Daoism, we need to understand some basic concepts or teachings of ancient Chinese philosophical and religious beliefs, of ancient Chinese thought, particularly in regard to religion. The ancient Chinese people, long before the time that Confucius was born, believed that every natural object was composed of two opposite extremes. But these two opposite extremes were supplementary. They were both necessary, and they answered one to another. These were considered life forces, and they were called the yin and the yang. The yang, according to Chinese belief, is masculine, active, dry, bright, and positive. But the yin, on the other hand, is the very opposite. The yin is feminine, fertile, dark, cold, wet, and negative. Now, I don't know how this originated or who first thought it up, but anyway, this was the belief of the ancient Chinese people. This belief is still being perpetuated today. My son, who preaches in the state of Minnesota in the United States, told me that recently he was walking in front of his house. Children had been playing there, and they had marked on the sidewalk with chalk, and they had written the yin and the yang and had put down the symbols for them. He overheard some of the teenagers speaking in church, and they were discussing the yin and the yang. Apparently they had learned it in the schools. It has come in and being made popular through the New Age movement. The sun, for example, was considered to be yang. The soil of the earth was considered to be yin, but together the yin and the yang supply what each other lacks and therefore provide bountiful harvests for man. The emperors of ancient China had a responsibility to govern the people, but in addition to this, they also were regarded as the representatives of heaven, and they had to perform priestly acts for the people of their nation. Ancient China's economy was agricultural. Since it was dependent upon farming, then each local area had its own gods of the soil that it worshipped and sacrificed to in order to guarantee that they had good crops. Each village would have a mound of earth which was called Shi, and this mound of earth symbolized the fertility of the soil. Dancing and singing and various ceremonies, including sacrifices, would be performed around the Shi at planting time and also harvest. About the time of Moses, that's about 1,500 years before Christ, a god by the name of Shang-Ti began to be worshipped in ancient China. Shang-Ti for a time was a very popular god. He was called the ruler on high and was believed to be an ancestral figure who lived in the upper reaches of the sky. He was consulted on occasion, particularly if there had been no rain or if they were about to go out to war. Heaven itself was known as Tien, the abode of the great spirits. Tien, the abode of the great spirits. And the ancient Chinese people were polytheist, that is, they believed in many gods and many spirits. They worshiped many gods, gods of the hills, gods of the streams, gods of the mountains. Some of them were good and some of them were bad. In fact, you may recall that in our last lesson we studied animism, and really some of the religion of ancient China was animistic or had animistic beliefs in it. John B. Noss, who was a leading scholar in world religions in his lifetime, now deceased, but John B. Noss had this to say in his book, Man's Religions. He said, "Perhaps no people have gone to such length to keep the good spirits on their side as the Chinese, because no people have been more afraid of demons." Well, that helps us to understand the ancient Chinese religious beliefs. The Chinese emphasis on the family was expressed from the very earliest times of Chinese history in ancestor worship. We cannot put a date on the time that ancestor worship began. It was very ancient among the Chinese, and even in the time of Confucius, it had been practiced for many hundreds of years. We talked about ancestor worship when we spoke of animism, and we showed how ancestor worship is a part of animism. Well, it was also a part of ancient Chinese religion. It was believed that the spirits of the departed relatives had the power to bless their relatives who were living here on the earth. One's parents or grandparents or great-grandparents were now in the spirit world, and they were still concerned about what was going on earth, and so they would interfere in the affairs of their family on earth, either for good or bad. The ancestor spirits were dependent upon, for their happiness and continued existence in the spirit world, upon the gifts and the sacrifices of their descendants living on the earth. If their descendants neglected them, then they would become angry and would cause trouble on the earth. Daoism grew out of this religious background, and eventually it added many of these ideas into its system and became a religion. However, we must understand that Taoism, like Confucianism, was not a religion at first. It was not a religion. It was not developed to be a religion. The founder of Confucianism, Confucius, had no intention of starting a new religion. All he wanted to do was to reform society by reforming government and by reforming education. But his moral principles that he taught were gradually added to religious beliefs that were common, and a religion was developed, and then later, as we studied earlier, Confucius himself was regarded as a god. Well, the very same thing really happened in Daoism to a great extent, but to perhaps a lesser extent. At first, Daoism was simply a philosophy, a system of ethics, a way of living, a way of looking at things. There were no religious elements in it, but the religious elements of the day and time were added to make it into religion, and it's become a world religion. Not that it's universally spread throughout the world, but it is a major religion, or has been through the centuries. Daoism was founded by a legendary figure named Lao Tzu. Again, the T, I understand, has a D sound in the pronunciation, so Daoism was founded by a legendary figure whose name was Lao Tzu. There are many scholars who question if Lao Tzu lived at all. That is the reason we say he was a legendary figure. We cannot be sure that he actually lived, and yet his name occurs in history, or this name, Lao Tzu, occurs, and from very ancient times he has been regarded as the founder of Daoism. Lao Tzu, if he lived, was probably born about 600 BC. That means that he lived during the time of Confucius, and he also lived during the time of Gautama, who became the Buddha over in India. One legend says that Lao Tzu was never a young man, but that he was born old with white hair and wrinkled skin. Well, I doubt that that is true, but that is an interesting belief. The actual name of this man, who is known as Lao Tzu, is unknown. He was simply called Lao Tzu, which means the old philosopher. Lao Tzu means the old philosopher, and that's what he was called. And so we're talking simply about the old philosopher. We don't actually know his real name. But according to the legends that have come down, Lao Tzu held a very high position in the government of his home state of Chu. I don't know what the position was, but it was a very high position, and he was a highly respected man. But after many years of service in this position, he became disillusioned with politics and all the ornate and elaborate ceremonies of government, and he decided that this was not the way that men were meant to live, but he decided that actually we were meant to live on earth with as little ceremony as possible and with as little government as possible. He believed that people ought to live very, very simply. And because of this belief, he resigned his important job in the government and returned back to his home. But he found no peace in his home. There were many people who had heard of his views, of his philosophy, and they wanted to be his disciples. They wanted to learn from this wise man, and so they kept coming to him and troubling him, and he just wanted to be alone and to be at peace. And so finally he decided that in order to be at peace, he would have to completely leave China and go someplace else. And so he made up his mind that he would leave his home and that he would travel to western China, and that he would go through the Great Wall, one of the gates in the Great Wall, and retire somewhere in the west. But when he came to the border and attempted to cross, he was recognized by the border guard, according to the old legend, and the border guard refused to let him pass unless he left his philosophy behind. That is, he wanted other people to be able to hear and know this wise man's philosophy. And so So Lao Tzu was forced to postpone his journey temporarily. He left for 3 days and came back again after 3 days to the same border guard and handed him a small book. The book was called the Tao Te King. Again, the T is pronounced as a D. The Tao Te King. And in this small volume was contained the philosophy of Lao Tzu. Now, this small book is a fundamental text of Daoism. However, there are those scholars today who question that it was written by Lao Tzu. They say it was written much later. Whether it was or not, we have really no way of knowing today. But anyway, Lao Tzu left the book with the border guard, rode off into the sunset on a water buffalo, and was never seen again. And so that was the end of the old philosopher, so far as history knows. He just faded off into the sunset. It's interesting, there is an old legend about Lao Tzu meeting Confucius. Confucius, it is said, was a young man, already famous as a teacher, and he heard of Lao Tzu before he left China, and he came to visit him. Well, you remember Lao Tzu didn't like to have visitors. He wanted just to be left alone, and so he did not receive Confucius very well. And he talked to Confucius, and Confucius explained to him some of his philosophy, but the old philosopher didn't agree with it very much. Confucius explained that he believed that all men were good. And Lao Tzu simply replied, "It is not bathing that makes the pigeon white." And with that statement, profound or otherwise, he dismissed Confucius, and that meeting was history. Well, that's interesting. Whether it occurred or not, we don't know. But about 3 centuries after the time that Lao Tzu probably lived, there was another man by the name of Chuang-Tzu, who became a disciple of the philosophy of Lao Tzu, and he began to write books, and he wrote a total of 33 books expounding upon the one tiny volume, the Tao Te King, that had been written by Lao Tzu. In 212 BC, Daoism was established by the emperor as the official religion of China. By 156 BC, the emperor began to offer sacrifices to Lao Tzu on behalf of the people. About the year AD 650, Lao Tzu's writings were made required studies in all the government schools. And so Daoism became a religion in China, and it existed alongside Confucianism for many, many centuries. In the year 1900, there was a rebellion in China called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900 was an effort to move all the foreigners out of China. Many of the Western nations had come in and had taken over portions of China. So the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 in China began with a group of young Taoists. These Taoists wanting to rid China of all foreign influence. Now, the Taoists believed that their bodies were immune to the bullets from foreigners' guns, because after all, Lao Tzu had said, when coming among soldiers, one need not fear arms and weapons. One need not fear arms and weapons. Well, these young Taoists soon learned that the man that they honored so greatly, Lao Tzu, was wrong. Their bodies were not immune to bullets. The original philosophical teachings of Daoism, or the original teachings, I should say, of Daoism, were more philosophical than religious. The religious element was added later. Now the word Tao itself means literally the path or the way. And so when we talk about the Tao, we mean the way. We mean the path. But the path to what? Well, the path to peace and contentment. It is very hard, however, the scholars say, to define the word Tao, for it is commonly said by Taoists that the Tao that can be expressed in words is not the Tao. And so I guess it's something that's better felt than told. But the idea of the Tao is based on the natural flow or rhythm of things. The seasons of the year follow one another naturally. There's spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And then the seasons go through again. The periods of a person's life also follow one another naturally: birth, infancy, childhood, youth, middle age, old age, and then death. And so that is the idea of the Tao. Let things go according to their natural order, their natural flow. Do not try to prevent that or change it in any way, and by letting things go naturally, then you will find peace. As someone has said, the basic idea of Daoism is, why fight it? Just go with the flow. And that may be a very good modern way of expressing it. But the belief is that when one becomes attuned to the harmony of things, he will have a balance of yin and yang, and being well balanced, having the yin and the yang, he will then become one with all things. Some of the teachings of Daoism will help us to understand the concept of Tao better, perhaps. Let's notice some of the statements that are attributed to Lao Tzu and other early adherents of Daoism. One of them is, leave all things to take their natural course and do not interfere. Another one is, the ideal man has no ambitions or ego or desire for fame or power or prominence. Well, now that sounds like a good statement, doesn't it? And it is good up to a point, but if one carried that out fully, it would take away initiative. It would prevent the advancement of mankind in many areas. Here's another statement concerning the idea of the Tao. If one does not meddle with others, human relations will fall as the Tao brings them to pass naturally and simply. There will be a spontaneous birth of true love, real kindness, simplicity, and contentment in the lives and relationship of men. Now, Daoism is based on the same idea that Confucianism is based upon, and that is that man is basically good by nature. I believe that man is basically good by nature. However, the Bible tells me that there is a tempter called Satan who tempts man and uses the lust of the flesh to draw man away and entice him to sin. Daoism and Confucianism, neither one, believed in that concept and really did not have a clear-cut concept of sin, and therefore they had the belief that since all men are good, you just leave people alone and let them do their thing, and their thing that they will do will be that which is right and best. But it really doesn't work that way because of the presence of the tempter, Satan. Eventually, Taoists began to claim that the one who mastered the Tao possessed a certain magical power which would make him immune to attack from wild beasts or violent men, or even the ravages of age and death. No doubt there's some of us who would like to master that today so that we would not be subject to the ravages of age and death. It taught that one must get his life in harmony with the Tao, and he did this through the practice of wu-wei. Wu-wei, and wu-wei literally means inaction, that is, not doing anything. It is said that if one avoids stress caused by participation in the affairs of the world and stays in the background, his odds for survival are much greater than they would be otherwise. And I suppose that if one doesn't do anything and one doesn't get involved in anything, he's not going to have stress, and he might live a little bit longer upon this earth, but one could not be a Christian and take an attitude such as this, because a Christian has to be actively involved in this life in order to teach the gospel and influence others for Jesus Christ. Later, Daoism added the religious ideas of ancient China as well as Buddhism in order to form religious Daoism. Later Daoism added religious ideas of ancient China and Buddhism to form religious Daoism. Religious Daoism today has a priest and temples and sacred books. They worship various gods of ancient China. Daoism has developed some religious ideas of its own. For example, Daoism developed an idea of paradise as being a place of contented delight, and it was believed that it was located in a place called the Three Isles of the Blessed. The Three Isles of the Blessed, which was supposed to be located somewhere in the Eastern Sea between China and Japan. Daoism also developed an idea of a place of punishment. But this place of punishment was more like purgatory than hell. Souls of those who were evil would go there and be punished for a time and then could be released and I suppose go on to the Three Isles of the Blessed. So that's more like the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Some of the particular gods worshipped by the Taoists were, first of all, the eight immortals. The eight immortals. They were believed to live in the Isles of the Dead. They had once been ordinary people living upon this earth, but because they had accepted the Tao and had lived according to that way, they had become immortal. That is, they had come to the point where they could live forever like the gods, and they were worshipped as gods. In addition to this, another interesting god of the Taoists, and this comes from ancient Chinese belief, was called the god of the stove. The god of the stove. It was believed that the god of the stove lived in the chimney corner of the kitchen of every Chinese home, and he observed the actions of each Chinese family. The god of the stove then was the one who was aware of what was going on in the home. When children would misbehave, their parents would caution them to be very quiet and say, if you don't be quiet, the god of the stove will hear what you're saying and he will write it down and report it to the higher gods, and then you will be in trouble. Once a year there would be a ceremony where food and drink, paper money and other things would be burned in the chimney. This was burned as an offering to the god of the stove, but the smoke of that offering made it possible for the god of the stove to ascend up in the smoke to heaven, where he would report to the higher gods on the activities of the family. Now this is a view of Taoism, and my understanding is that this is one of the views that has survived to this very day. Well, Taoism itself survives to this very day. Taoism is still a religion, a force in the world. It's been around for 2,500 years or so, and it is still with us. It perhaps has largely died out in China as a result of communist rule and influence, although there may be people who practice it privately, but Taoism still thrives as a religion in countries such as Taiwan and Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore, in areas of the world where there are large populations of Chinese people. Many of the principles of Taoism were adopted in the United States of America and in the countries of Western Europe in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. We had a generation at that time who were involved in taking drugs. They were sometimes referred to as hippies, and it was a part of their thinking or their philosophy, or at least a part of their thinking and their philosophy was borrowed from Taoism. One of their sayings was that we need to tune out and drop out of society. That is, not be involved in the affairs of the world, in whatever is going on. We just do our own thing and do what comes naturally and not worry about anything. Well, that's from Taoism. That's where they received that idea. Principles of Taoism, such as the yin and the yang, are being resurrected today in many parts of the world because they are a major part of the New Age movement. Now later on in our series on world religions, we will have 2 lessons on the New Age movement. The New Age movement incorporates or borrows many ideas from many different religions, especially Hinduism and Daoism, and has come up with a new religion which is becoming very popular in some parts of the world. Well, Taoists need the gospel of Jesus Christ to give them forgiveness of sin and eternal life just as anyone else does. The Tao is believed to be the way to happiness, the way to peace, the way to salvation. But friends, the Tao is not the way. Jesus Christ is the way. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes unto the Father but by me." John 14, verse 6. Now, what I want us to do in the remainder of our class period is that I want us very briefly to go back and to review what we've studied today about Taoism. I want you to be careful that you do not confuse Taoism with Confucianism. The two are very similar, and yet the two are different. Taoism is based on the Chinese ideas of yin and yang. Yin and yang. Yang is said to be masculine, active, dry, bright, and positive. Yin is feminine, fertile, dark, cold, wet, and negative. But both the yin and the yang are necessary. They answer to one another. They supplement one another. They complement one another. And each person has some of the yin and some of the yang in him, and it's only when these are balanced that one can find happiness and well-being and can truly find the Tao or the way. We want to remember too that Shang-Ti, the god or the father of the sky, one of the great gods of ancient Chinese religion, began to be worshipped about 1500 BC during probably the time of Moses, and was the god who was widely worshipped during the time that Taoism began. The Chinese idea of heaven is called Tian, and it means simply the abode of the great spirits. Taoism was founded by Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu. Now, the name or the figure of Lao Tzu is legendary. That is, we have many stories that have come down to us about him from very ancient times, but there are those who doubt that he ever actually lived. Well, we don't know that for sure. Anyway, Lao Tzu means simply the old philosopher. The old philosopher. Perhaps it was that someone came up with the philosophy of Daoism and then gave credit to it to simply an old philosopher and called Lao Tzu, and eventually the term the old philosopher or Lao Tzu came to be regarded as the name of a man. We don't know that for sure. That may be the case. The book that supposedly was written by Lao Tzu is called the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching. It is a small volume, but it contains the basic teachings of Taoism. A later disciple of Taoism, a man by the name of Chuang-Tzu, made Lao Tzu's writings very popular. He wrote 33 different books about these writings. Now, the word Tao itself means path or way. Tao means path or way. If we wanted to express the idea of the Tao in our language today, we could say just leave all things to their natural course. Or we might say it here in America, just go with the flow. In other words, do not worry about anything, just let things happen as they will. That's the basic philosophy of Taoism. The Taoists have a belief in paradise. They call it the Three Isles of the Dead. It's supposed to be located in the Eastern Sea between China and Japan. One of the interesting gods of Taoism, a god that has long been in Chinese religion, is called the god of the stove. The god of the stove is believed to live in the chimney corner, and he reports on the deeds of a family during the year. He ascends up to heaven once a year on the smoke of an offering and reports to the higher gods whether or not the family in whose house he lives have behaved themselves and been as they should be. Well, that basically concludes our study of Taoism. In our next lesson, we will look at another world religion, one that is found not in the ancient East or in the Far East, but one that is an ancient religion, but it's found in the Middle East, primarily in the nation of Iran. At least it originated in Iran, although it has many of its adherents today in India. The language that or the religion that we're talking about is the religion known as Zoroastrianism. And so we hope that you will join us in our next class period for a study of a very interesting religion known as Zoroastrianism.
This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.